Okay, in the last two classes, we discussed about how we can uh, get the Euler-Lagrange equation, which would eventually give us the differential equation from which we can solve for a variable. Remember, our problem in hand is to optimize this functional, which is defined as some sort of integration x1 to x2, uh, f of y and y prime dx, and that we are willing to minimize with respect to y and y of y prime. So this is a problem in hand, and we do not know what sort of function y is, and for that we used Euler-Lagrange equation. Uh, and So we derived that Euler-Lagrange equation basically gives us the differential equation from which we can get the minima for this functional. Now, one other way to look into this problem could be through. So we use the formulation that we used y tilde, which is essentially the optimum solution that we do not know, plus epsilon times eta of x, where eta we refer to as a variation, and this one was a scalar, which basically means epsilon is from the set of all real numbers. It can be positive, negative, zero, etc. And this thing, which is a variation, which is kind of makes y tilde and admissible function. So functions which qualifies for uh, uh, candidate for a solution, which qualifies to be candidate for this solution to this problem. And what are the qualifications? That it satisfies the essential boundary conditions, that is, in gamma y, uh, eta of x should be 0, or if it is given that y tilde at x1 is y1, that implies eta at x1 equals 0. And if it is given that y tilde at x2 is y2, if the values are known, then this quantity is 0. Okay. If we're already not familiar with the term, these are called Dirichlet boundary conditions. Okay. Uh, Now we would introduce something called a delta operator, which basically means if I take delta operator on y, that becomes y tilde minus y, which would tell you that essentially delta y is epsilon times eta of x. Now this delta operator can also be done on um, the definite integral in hand, or the so-called functional, loosely defined as the function of a function, because its value depends on what type of function y is. So this quantity is also I tilde minus I, where I tilde is essentially x1 to x2 f of y tilde prime dx, and I, of course, is the way that has been defined, x1 to x2 f of y prime dx. Now it can be shown that delta of the derivative of y is essentially uh, sorry, okay, uh, how do I do undo? Okay, so the delta operated on the derivative of y is essentially dy tilde dx minus dy dx, which, so because anytime you are doing the delta operation, that's what this means. So this quantity, so it can operate on function, it can also operate on definite integral. Now I hope you realize the difference between a function and a definite integral. Definite integral is just a number, and it doesn't depend on x. It may depend on the functional form of y, but it doesn't depend on x. uh, and this y delta y right here, it is a function itself. Okay, it depends on what it actually changes with the values of x. Okay, so if i if I do the delta operator on the derivative, this is what I get, uh, which is basically the derivative of y tilde minus the derivative of y. And this could also be written, because derivative is a linear operation, which would show that this quantity is nothing but, or I mean, this thing could be uniquely defined as delta y prime. It means both the delta operator on the derivative, or the derivative of the delta operator. So whether you do derivative first or delta operation doesn't matter. And same thing goes with the integration, because integration is also a linear operation. At this point, we would also define the delta operator on f, which would be f of y tilde prime minus f y prime. Now this, the first term, can be expanded in Taylor series. Sorry. And then you have order delta y squared, order delta y prime squared terms. So you have higher order terms essentially. So these two are the only linear terms. So taking partial derivatives with respect to y and y prime. Okay. So that basically tells us this quantity right here, delta I, which is I tilde minus I. Acha, by the way, then you have f y prime. Okay. So you can basically subtract these two, cancel these two actually. Acha. So once you do this delta operation, so if you compare the two definite integrations, and as we have discussed, uh, integration is a linear operation. So basically, I can write this to be integration x1 to x2 del f del y delta y plus del f del y prime delta y prime dx as the first term. And then I can also write, so I'm basically taking these two terms in the integration, because once I'm doing integration, so integration f y prime dx and integration f y prime dx from I tilde and I will cancel out. So you are left with this term, and higher order terms. So then we can write terms involving order delta y squared and order delta y prime squared. And from, so uh, this delta is called the variation. So this is the variation operation going on each of the variables. So this is y, this is the variation of y, and this quantity right here is the total variation of the definite integral, of which this term right here you would refer to as the first variation of uh, your definite integral. So the first term is so this linear portion, linear in delta y and delta y prime, is what you would refer to as the first variation, and rest are, the rest of the terms also contribute to the total variation, but we are only interested in the first variation. And we would use the same logic that we used earlier to set this first variation equal to 0, because this has to be this has to be true. Sorry, uh, this quantity, because for an arbitrary variation for all delta y and delta y prime, this quantity must be greater than 0, because I is the minimum value, and I tilde should be greater than or equal to I, which basically means this is greater than or equal to 0, and that must be true for any arbitrary delta y and delta y prime. And then we would argue that the most significant term over here in this expression is a linear term, and depending on the sign of delta y, actually the delta y prime at this point would not matter, because we would you would integrate by parts, and we would have del f del y minus ddx of del f del y prime times delta y plus the boundary conditions, which are del f del y prime times delta y between at x1 and x2. And as we have discussed, that this delta y again must be 0. If eta is 0, then this delta y, which is the difference between y tilde and y, must be 0 at x1 and x2. So delta y, as you can see, the is nothing but eta times epsilon, and that must also be 0 at x1 and x2, which basically tells that this quantity right here is 0. and and then we have the higher order terms in the total variation. Now we argued that the first term is linear in delta y, so delta y dx, so linear in delta y, and and we argued that depending on the sign of epsilon, this quantity could either be increasing or be decreasing as we are approaching epsilon equals 0. Okay, so so uh, but we want this term to be, if this is the most significant term close to epsilon equals 0, then we want this term to be always decreasing as we are approaching 0, whether we are approaching from left or whether we are approaching from right. And the only way that should be true is by making this term 0, and let the second order term, which would be is, a squared term involving epsilon, which would have epsilon square in it, and that would be sign independent. So we need a sign independent term to be the most significant term. So therefore, we need the first term to be 0 if we want uh, mm, I to have the minimum value at y and y prime. And that basically gives a condition that that this first variation of y equals 0. And eventually we also argue that that is true for any arbitrary variation of y, which basically tells us this quantity right here is 0 actually, because if that has to be true for any arbitrary variation, I mean, this arbitrary variation could be trivially 0. This is a function of x, and this could actually be 0 on itself, or it could be some other function. It could be just a constant. It could be just 1 everywhere, or it could be this very function right here, this delta y. is any arbitrary function, so it can be except from the boundary, except for at these two locations. It is, so I can take delta y to be this variable as well. This is also a function of x, and that is also an admissible variation. So which basically tells us that this quantity, so in that case we would have, if I take delta y equals del f del y minus ddx of del f del y prime itself. So that tells us that integration between x1 to x2, del f del y minus ddx of del f del y prime squared dx equals 0, and that would be only true if this quantity is trivially 0 everywhere between x1 and x2. And that is the only thing that you are claiming, that only between x goes from x1 to x2, and I'm deliberately not putting less than or greater than equal. So only between these two boundary points is that relation true, that this quantity, this so-called Euler-Lagrange equation, should be true between these two values. Okay, now we already have done this derivation, okay, in our way. But what is the point of involving a delta operator? Because that generalizes the formulation. I mean, we can use a delta parameter or delta operator on y, which is a function, f, which is a function comprising of y and y prime, and also on I, which is just the definite integral of f between two limits. Okay, but we'll use the delta operator at later stage of our class, and that's why we need to introduce that. Okay, এই অবধি ক্লিয়ার আছে তো সবার?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I've been using this app, which is called the Whiteboard, for over an year, but now they have, actually today they have changed the interface, so I'm not finding a lot of options. Just to clear the screen.
স্যার এই ডিরাইভেশন গুলো কি মানে এক্সামে আসতে পারে নাকি
আসতেই পারে।
প্র্যাকটিস?
হ্যাঁ।
ওকে।
So key to this derivation, key to arriving at Euler-Lagrange equation is that is to use the arbitrariness of delta y. Please remember the importance of arbitrariness of delta y, or the variation of the arbitrariness of the variation of y, because this is what makes the variational form equivalent to the so-called strong form. And we'll explain in another half an hour what are strong form and what are not strong form, basically weak form. So we'll explain them in a while. Okay. Now let us introduce something called, so because we are aiming at willingly or unwillingly to solve a set of problems in elasticity, mostly in elasticity. Uh, so let's introduce variational formulation in elasticity. And of course, we can introduce variational formulation into full 3D elasticity. But right at this point, we'll only introduce variational formulation to one-dimensional problem. And what is an one-dimensional problem? We have this rod right here, which is the so-called bar in finite element method. Now, typically you have seen that rod is fixed here, which makes x as gamma u. What is u? U at any location, at any given x, u is the amount of displacement uh, of the rod. It can be positive or negative, but at x equals 0, u is 0, and that makes uh, it gamma u. Earlier we had explained that why do we need essential boundary conditions, or in other words, why are the essential boundary conditions essential? We showed that we can have a spring in equilibrium, so-called equilibrium, and not be able to determine what are the displacements of the two ends, unless of course we specify that one of the ends has so and so u value. Let's say u equals 0 at the left end. Okay, so that's what makes it important for us to have uh, an essential boundary condition. Now, now when you are considering an one-dimensional object, there is one rigid body degree of freedom. That means if the spring were a rigid body, it could have only one degree of freedom. Sorry, degree of freedom. Rigid body degree of freedom. So if the spring were a rigid body, it could have only one degree of freedom, and that is to move along its axis. And imagining also the spring is a one-dimensional object, it cannot move laterally, no, and it cannot move out of plane. So that is the only degree, and it cannot also rotate or do anything else. So the only type of motion that it could do is to translate along x-axis to the left or to the right. Now, as we know, a deformable body has, in theory, has infinite number of degrees of freedom. And what is the meaning of that? Meaning is that even if you hold the spring at one of the ends, that is, you prevent, you basically capture this rigid body degree of freedom. You do not let it have a rigid body motion. Rigid body motion means it does. Rigid body is the one that doesn't deform. So the spring could, move along. If the spring were rigid body, by that I mean the spring is not elongating, but it could still move along one direction. Okay, it could move towards the left or towards the right. Now, if I prevent the rigid body degree of freedom and assume that the spring is actually a deformable body, it can have deformations. Each point on the string, okay, could be deforming uh, in a particular way. But imagining if it is a linear spring and it is kind of uniform and homogeneous, so we can assume that the deformation is linearly changing from this end to that end. Okay, and on applying a force of F, which also give you the same free body diagram as this one, because the support, if it is able to hold the spring in its position, then it is also providing F to keep the spring in equilibrium. And this quasi-equilibrium problem gives you a deflection at the free end, so-called free end, and that deflection, if it is u, you can more or less assume that it is linearly changing across the length of the spring. So you can basically assume that to start with, the spring has 2 degrees of freedom. one of which is like a rigid body degree of freedom. The other one is the degree of freedom of the uh, due to the deformability of the spring. And you need to prevent those rigid body degrees of freedom when you are trying to solve problems in equilibrium, in statics, or in finite element method, whatever you may want to call it. So that's why we need a gamma u where we must be holding the bar. Um, the other end is the so-called free end, and you have by now seen that at the free end we are applying some sort of force or some sort of force P. What you might not be seeing a lot is a distributed load in association to the point load at the tip. Typically, for bars, we do not talk about distributed load, but there could be distributed load. I mean, if you really think about it, if I have this bar right here, which is hanging due to its own weight, okay, so that is actually a distributed load. You take a differential element of length dx. So from the top, it is being held by a force F plus dF. At the bottom, imagining this is what my X is, at the bottom, it is carrying the weight of whatever is below the bar, below that segment of the bar, differential X segment of the bar, which is F, and that F is essentially the weight of the bar that is remaining below, and then it is also acted on by its own weight, which is a times dx times rho times g, okay, acting on it. So so that would give you the value df equals this much, okay. Hmm. So all I'm trying to say here, the distributed load on a bar is not and we'll call it q of x. This q need not be a constant, this could also be a function of x, okay. So I can give you an example. Let's see, if you have this bar which is being rotated at the about the axis in the origin with an angular velocity of omega, and if you take a differential element, so on the differential element, of course there is f and df, f plus df right here, but it is also acted on by this much force because of the rotation. I'm trying asking you to solve the problem in the non-inertial frame or the rotating coordinate system, which would tell you that it is also acted on by this much force going outward, which is uh, rho times a times dx makes up for the differential volume. Then you multiply, or sorry, the differential mass, and then you have omega squared times r being the body force acceleration. What is body force acceleration? It is somewhat like gravity, but where gravity is a constant, like in this case, this is not a constant. This is dependent on not r but x. So this is the x, and if you imagine the bar is rotating about its axis, so as you can see, this q right here, q of x, could be a function of x. That's all I'm trying to say here. So whatever it may be, we are trying to solve a general situation. So imagine you have a bar which has a distributed load as well as a point load at the tip, and at one of the ends it is fixed, okay. And mm, and we need to find out how u of x should be, okay. uh, so there are two ways we can solve this problem, okay. So I'll start by the one that we are not familiar with. So we are so far familiar with Newtonian mechanics. We are still talking about classical mechanics. We are not talking about anything related to uh, some sort of quantum mechanics or relativity or anything, nothing like that. But even in classical mechanics, you can have, so basically it's not Newtonian mechanics, it's actually Newtonian approach. So we'll talk about the Newtonian approach in a while, but before going into Newtonian approach, uh, let us first introduce something called Hamiltonian principle. And for that, I'll use another example. Okay. And imagine this one has a displacement of x1 and this one has a displacement of x2. Okay. So can you tell me what is the net strain energy in the system? So in this problem, there is no external force. So we are talking about natural vibration of the system. So all I'm asking you to tell me how much is the strain energy. For example, if x2 is 0, okay, sorry. So imagine if the so this is a 2 degree of freedom system. Now if the mm, point mass m1 moves by a distance of x1, so this spring right here is stretched by a distance of x1, and therefore it develops a strain energy of k half k x1 square. These are all linear springs. Now same thing applies to k3, but when it comes to k2, the displacement of both m1 and m2 matter. So it is half k2 x1 minus x2 whole square. Doesn't matter whether you take x1 minus x2 or x2 minus x1. So this is the net strain energy of the system. And okay, and we define something called a potential energy, which would be the strain energy minus something called an work potential. Now, work potential would only be there if there is an external source. Now, here we are learning something new, Hamiltonian principle. So everything I say, you'll have to take my word. Okay. So 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 there is something called work potential, which would only be there if there is an external force. But here we are talking about natural vibration of the system, so there is no work potential. Now, this thing is the kinetic energy, and the kinetic energy would be simply half m x1 dot squared plus half m x2 dot squared. Okay, and
তাহলে M1 M2 হবে ওটা।
m1 m2, yes, correct, m1 and m2. Now you define something called Lagrangian, which is essentially the kinetic energy minus the potential energy. And this quantity right here is called the action, and the quantity is the integration of between T1 to T2 of this quantity. So you see it already has some sort of energy, kinetic energy minus the potential energy, and that quantity integrated over time is defined as the action, and that becomes our functional of the day. And the Hamiltonian principle says that x and x dot, in this case x1, x2, x1 dot and x2 dot, must be such that they minimize this so-called action. Now you need to understand that uh, x1 and x2 are independent of one another. Okay, so in this case we will have two Euler Lagrange equations, and in this case the independent variable is time, and the two dependent variables are x1 and x2. Okay, since x1 and x2 are independent of one another, see, x1 and x1 dot are not completely independent of one another. That's why involving two variables we get only one Euler Lagrange equation. But since x1 and x2 are completely independent variables, that's why we get two Euler Lagrange equations. And if you have already been able to relate, then you would realize this quantity is going to be del L del x1 minus ddt of del L del x1 dot equals 0. And the other differential equation should be, or not differential equation, it's not a differential equation, the other equation should be, so in this case we would be getting a set of algebraic equations, ddt of del L del x2 dot. Okay, no, sorry, you will be getting a set of differential equations. So now can you write down these two equations involving x1 and x2? এই দুটো ইকুয়েশন লেখা যাবে?
Yes, sir, লেখা
So
তো
you
যাবে, মানে
have the
দুটো
total
partially.
expression for L, which is a Lagrangian, and all you have to do is take partial derivatives with respect to x1, x2, x1 dot and x2 dot. And then when you take the derivatives with respect to the dot quantities, you also need to take derivatives of them, total derivatives of them with respect to t. Okay, so maybe we can start with the first one. So if we do the first one, so with respect to x1 we have del L del x1 equals you see it is t minus v, right? So we are going to get minus k1 x1, and then we have minus k2 x1 minus x2. Okay, because L is T minus V, so del L del x1 is minus del V. See, x1 only appears in V and inside AC, the strain energy. So it is essentially del AC del x1 with a negative sign because it is minus V right here. And then we can do x1 dot, and that would tell us, that would give us m1 x1 dot, and do a time derivative on that one will give us m1 x1 double dot, and that would essentially tell us that m1 x1 double dot plus k1 x1 plus k2 x1 minus x2 equals 0. And from that we can write the other equation is going to be m2 x2 double dot plus k3 x2 plus k2 x2 minus x1 equals 0. So these are the two differential equations that you need to solve simultaneously. How do you solve the set of differential equation? Okay, ordinary set of differential equations uh, which are also linear but more than one simultaneous equations. Uh, that is not our question, but arriving at those two differential equations uh, is what we are looking for. Now, there is another way uh, to, so we use Hamiltonian principle, we minimize the action, and we wrote the Euler-Lagrange equations for action, minimization of action. Uh, what we could have done is use Newton's formula, which is we would look in, we would take this block of mass m right here, and on this side it is being pulled by a force k2 times x2 minus x1, and on this side it is being pulled, so x1 is towards the right, okay, and it is on the left side it is being pulled by k1 times x1, and therefore we can write, so this one is towards the left, hence negative. One second. Okay, so now from this free body diagram, so this is Newtonian approach where we draw the free body diagram and we directly write down m x1 double dot, which is the mass times acceleration, is the net force, which is whatever is a force towards the right, which is k2 times x2 minus x1 minus k1 x1, because that is towards the left, okay, and eventually if you rearrange, this is what you are going to get. Basically the same set of equations, which goes to show that both Hamiltonian principle and Newton's approach, okay, basically gives you the same set of equations. But you might say at this point, coming up with the strain energy and kinetic energy and writing a Lagrangian and that action needs to be minimized. All of this, those are new, and why should we accept them, and why should we learn something new which we can do using Newton's method? So number one is that even in Newton's method, we are using Newton's laws. We take the laws on their face value. For example, that mass times acceleration is the net force that we are accepting on its face value. And same thing we can do with minimization of action in Hamiltonian principle. One more thing, here we are dealing with one dimensional problem. But imagine if you were to deal with multi-axial problem with more than, I mean, with too many degrees of freedom. Hamiltonian principle a lot of times proves to be very useful, given the fact that it doesn't work with vectors. Newton's method works with vectors because it is directly relating acceleration to forces. And you need to draw free body diagram for Newton's method. And you need to identify which of the forces are acting on which body individually. Okay. So if I give you a known number of degrees of freedom, say a known number of mass, let's say 2 in this case, then you can identify that mass 1 is interacting with mass 2 through the spring K2, and then you can write down all the forces which could be coming to mass 1, M1. Okay. But you imagine there are 10 bodies and all of them are interacting with each other through a set of springs, and also the problem is 2D or 3D. In that case, it becomes really complicated to use Newton's method. What would be much simpler is to use Hamiltonian's principle, which only deals with scalar quantities like strain energy and potential energy and kinetic energy. Okay. And then you straight away get your functional to be optimized. That So the problem becomes more routine. Okay. So what is useful in any numerical method, you should be able to code that into a computer. And in order for you to be able to code that into computer, you want things to be in a certain routine, in a certain rule or certain order. You don't want to emphasize on each and every object that is there, each and every mass that is there, each and every degree of freedom that is there. So that's why we can use the Hamiltonian principle. Acha, at this point I would also introduce that so what we have seen that this Hamiltonian principle works pretty well with this three spring and two mass system. But I'll also extend the idea that this works pretty well for our bar problem as well.
Sir, can we use the Newton's formula in this problem to find out the UX?
Of course we can, but that's not the point. We are here not to find out the differential equation and able to solve this. You see, I can give you the differential equation for this one. It is u double prime e a u double prime. So in elasticity, uh, plus possibly plus q of x equals 0. That's the differential equation. It's a second order linear differential equation, and that's all you got to solve. Okay, that I can simply give you the differential equation if you want that. Okay. uh, but can you make a generalized solution? That's the goal. Can you make a generalized solution for any arbitrary function q? uh, Not going for indefinite integral. Okay. Imagine this q of x could be a constant. It could be any arbitrary function as well. It could be sine hyperbolic function also. Okay. And maybe even more complicated function. So we want to have a generalized formulation for any arbitrary form of q. Okay, we want to develop a numerical method. It's a very simple problem. A bar problem is very simple problem. Even in your strength of materials, some of you probably didn't go through bar set of problems because they are so trivial. Right? Because you know that you can simply divide the p by the cross section area, and that becomes your stress. And then you divide that with Young's modulus, then that becomes your strain, and that strain multiplied with the length, essentially becomes your elongation, but that is a tip deflection. And the problem with us is that in undergrads, even in undergrads, being mechanical engineers, this is how we learned how to define strain, and that is so stupid. Okay, strain is definitely not strain is definitely not U divided by L. We never developed the idea that U could be changing along its length. I mean, sorry. You could be U is obviously changing along its length, but the strain could be also a variable along its length, and that's what happens when this Q of X is non-zero. When Q of X is non-zero, see this strain right here. This is also not constant along the length. It could be changing. Okay, and the strain is only defined for a differential element. If you have a differential element dx, okay, and let's say post application of the force, distributed load, it elongates so to the left it elongates by let's say u, and towards the right it elongates by u plus du. Then uh, then the change in length is u plus du. So essentially it is u plus du minus u. So this gives you the change in length divided by x. That's what is defined as strain, which is essentially du dx or u prime. We are not brought up with the the correct definition of strain. I mean, forget the entire undergrad, even at the end of the masters. When I ask somebody what is the definition of strain, it is change in length per unit length. That's the definition you learned when you were in probably ninth standard, and you are not in ninth standard. That's not how you are supposed to define strain. And no, when I ask you what is the unit of stress, that is not force by area. That's not even a unit of anything. That's at best the dimension of stress, and that is also the dimension of pressure, and that is also the dimension of any modulus, let's say Young's modulus or shear modulus. When I ask you what is the unit of stress, the correct answer is this: MPa or PSI. Because when I later ask somebody that force by area is not a unit of anything, then people come up with this answer: Newton by meter squared. And that quantity itself has a name. Okay, nobody cares to mention that. Then I ask that person what is the name of that unit. Then somebody says Pascal, but Pascal is a very tiny. Even if you consider it to be a unit of stress, that's a very tiny unit of stress. The problem is it's just 1 Newton, 100 gram in gravitational unit, 100 gram over a meter squared. A meter squared is enough area for at least 6 people to stand on, and each of those 6 people could be weighing over 60 kgs. So you can imagine how tiny a pressure or stress 1 Pascal is. So the correct unit of stress should be megapascal or psi. Now, PSI and MPa are not of the same order. I believe 1 MPa is around 145 PSI, but that still is a high enough, a large enough unit to be considered for stress. You need to remember that as mechanical engineers, a lot of times we work with steel alloys, and typically uh, the yield stress would be somewhere around 100 to 400 MPa. That is on an average 200 MPa. The ultimate stress could be 400 or 500 MPa. So that's the reasonable unit for stress. Anyways, let's move on to. So it's not about whether we can solve this problem using Newton's method. Of course, this is the simplest problem in the book. Of course, we can solve using any method we want. But the reason for us to know about different methods is that we can correlate between one method and the other method. Okay, and eventually we are trying to get to a finite element method, which is a numerical method, where we would be trying to solve those differential equations numerically. Okay, so if you want to develop the formulation for a numerical method, should we start with the most difficult problem in the book, or should he start from the most simplest problem? So you are actually starting with the simplest problem. And because for the simplest problem we would be having the closed form solution. That means we can directly integrate, directly write down the differential equation, directly integrate it, and compare the solution of the analytical method, which is the direct integration, with the uh, with a numerical method. So that way we have the essence of how much error that we get. So uh, yeah, yes, of course the new numerical methods are supposed to be used for problems where we cannot use the analytical methods or closed form solution, where we cannot directly. So see, if this q of x is something like uh, mm, mm, c times x, you can readily integrate this equation. So u is going to be a cubic function. That's the answer. U is going to be a cubic function. Now, um, but uh, but the thing is, a numerical method which is supposed to be used for the problems where we cannot use a closed form solution like this one. But how do we benchmark something? How do we get the idea that this method is going to give us accurate solution in certain conditions, even in certain conditions? Let's say mesh refinement, let's say going for so-called higher order shape functions. Okay, so whether or not a certain method can be improved in certain ways, how do we know that unless we benchmark with some of the simplest problems for which we have readily available closed form solutions? So that's the idea. We are starting with the closed form solutions. And later on, we would see that when we have multiple bars available and all those bars oriented in different directions, basically forming a truss structure, okay, then even with the simplest differential equation, going for the closed form solution is not even an option. You would have to succumb to finite element method one way or the other. Right now what you are thinking, I know that we solved trust problems and we didn't require finite element method. You are completely wrong. You only solve trust problems in relation to rigid body mechanics, where you only consider how much force is at the certain joint or how much force is on a certain body. You never dealt with the idea of how much is the deflection of those members. Okay, in finite element method you can readily do that. Once you have the formulation for the single bar in a single direction, then you can improvise on that and do it for n number of bars, uh, arbitrarily oriented and connected with each other, that you can readily solve. So that's why we are building our numerical method with a set of benchmarking with the simplest problems right here. Okay, okay, so equivalent of that, this is a problem in quasi-static. Okay, this is not a dynamic problem. The bar is not accelerating towards the left or the right or anywhere else. So it is stationary, it is in equilibrium, so it's an equilibrium problem. So there is no question of t. Okay, so for us the f of u and u prime is this quantity. So there is a so this potential, so the so-called potential energy, we are trying to optimize this potential energy. Sorry, not this one. So we are trying to minimize the potential energy, which is the combination of the strain energy minus the work potential. Now we are trying to minimize it with respect to u and u prime. I'll later explain how does the u prime come to the picture. Um, so the strain energy is So half of, so if I integrate stress with strain, then I get strain energy density, that is the strain energy per unit volume. Then that I'll have to integrate with respect to x in this format from 0 to L, this whole quantity dx. So to get the strain energy, I'll have to integrate the strain energy density. Now, as you know, this quantity right here is half E epsilon squared. In linear elasticity, this is how, this is the strain energy, and the slope of the stress strain diagram is Young's modulus within linear elasticity. So this area is half E epsilon squared, and so this is the strain energy density. As you see, energy has the unit of joule or kilojoule. This one has a unit of megapascal, and this one lacks a unit. Okay, so what is missing is you need to multiply this with something like millimeter cube or meter cube in order to get uh, something in unit of energy. Okay, so this is the strain energy, and if I extend this further, if I simplify this further, this is how it looks like. Half E, as we discussed, epsilon is u prime squared dx. That is the strain energy. Now, how much is the work potential? Work potential is how much work you could have done. You see, you can imagine that you have applied this force P right here. Okay. Uh, and that you have gradually increased from 0 to P. Okay. And therefore, basically, at each equilibrium point, this sigma times A was your P. So as the epsilon increases, as the sigma increases, so increases the P. So that assuming that everywhere, so you, while you are applying P, the object was in quasi equilibrium. Okay, so this is the equilibrium equation. Now, frankly speaking, this work potential is just a fancy name to a mathematical term. Okay, this term just has to be in this format without the half sign or anything else. Okay, so so we refer to as work potential as work potential of P is P times U at x equal L. It's not half times P U L. Much like sigma times epsilon, half sigma epsilon, you might argue that to reach this sigma value, I have gradually increased the epsilon, and therefore the area under the curve is sigma epsilon. But P times UL is no area under the curve. It's just that the mathematical term has to be so and so format, so and so expression, in order for to give us the correct set of expressions. Okay. And we call it work potential. You can think in this way that since you have enough space to move by a distance of U of L, since you have enough capacity to apply a force of Pu, the maximum work you could have done is not this one, but this one. This is the P value. So this is the area we are talking about, P times U. Okay, but to be frank, it is just the mathematical term with correct coefficient with a fancy name. Okay, but there is also another force that is there, that is this distributed force right here, and that also does some, that also has work potential, and that work potential is essentially 0 to L q of L, sorry, q of x and u of x. You see, everywhere you are applying at every x there is certain q value, and that every location is moving by some u of x. Okay, so the point of application of the force moves by u of x. So the work potential is q of x times u of x, imagining q is changing from the fixed end to the free end, times dx. Okay, so this is the work potential. In the end, in the end, you have the following expression for the potential energy that you want to minimize, and that is 0 to L. Acha, by the way, you need to multiply with A in order to make a volume integration. EA U prime squared minus QU dx plus, acha, not plus, but minus P times U at L that you want to minimize with respect to U of x and U prime of x.
স্যার
Yes.
স্যার ওই ওয়ার্ক পোটেনশিয়ালের জায়গাটা একবার বলবেন, ওই যে লেফটে যে গ্রাফটা আপনি এঁকেছেন পি
হুম,
ভার্সেস ইউ,
হুম, হুম,
ঠিক আছে, ওখানে স্যার ওয়ার্ক পোটেনশিয়ালের ব্যাপারটা একটু বলুন, যে ওখানে স্কোয়ারটা এঁকেছেন ওটা কিভাবে একটু হলো।
হুম। See, the work potential, uh, mm, for the time being, it's just a made up term. Okay, it just needs to be P times UL. Okay, for you to get correct expression through Euler-Lagrange equation. That's the idea. Okay, but if you really want to make sense of work potential, you can think of in this way. You see, the external source which applied the P force had the maximum capacity of applying a force of P. Okay, and since the tip of the bar elongated by U of L, so the maximum displacement, I mean the space available for elongation was U of L. So now you can think of how much work could have been done instead of gradually increasing P from 0 to P, which we are assuming has happened because this structure is in quasi equilibrium. It has not accelerated anyway. So, um, so we can say that from the start, if we had applied P, so the P value doesn't change from 0, it just goes from P, it just remains P throughout, then the maximum amount of work you could have done is P times U of L. So that you can associate with work potential. But in reality, work potential is just a mathematical term, okay, in correct representation with correct expression.
ওকে স্যার, ওকে।
Okay, acha. So this is our expression. Acha. Um, what we will do next? Mm, can I erase something here? Now I can right away apply the Euler-Lagrange equation right here. Okay, but I would do something else. What I would do is, I would make a step and do this. Okay, 1 second. The next term is okay. Sorry. Um, okay, what we should be doing is taking the first variation, performing the delta operation on pi, and setting the first variation to. Okay, so the first variation of pi should go to 0 for any arbitrary delta u, and the first variation should be 0 to L. So basically we take derivative of, so this quantity is f of u prime. So basically del f del u delta u plus del f del u prime delta u prime dx minus p delta u of L. If I were to write the total variation of pi, that would be the first variation, then order delta y, and order delta y prime squared, each of them squared. So now if I write down the expressions, 0 to L. The first term is del f del u, which basically tells me it is q and q times delta u. And this term right here is, if I take derivative with respect to u prime, it is ea u prime delta u prime dx minus p delta u at L. And then I can write 0 to L. Then I can perform integration by parts of the second term, which would give me ea u prime delta u 0 L minus 0 to L ea u prime ea u prime. Then I need to take derivative of this whole thing because I'm doing integration by parts. So ea u prime dx of ea u prime, then minus q, this whole thing, times delta u times dx minus p times delta u at L equals 0. And this is true for all delta u. Okay, because this is true for all delta u, the only way I can make this happen is at first I would get the, because of the arbitrariness of delta u. So the first thing that I'm going to get is the differential equation. Remember, I can simply take delta u to be whatever is its multiplied to. So this term right here, for a uniform and homogeneous bar, we can assume these two quantities to be constant. Minus, not minus, it's actually plus, right? Plus q equals 0. So that can also be written as ea u double prime plus q of x equals 0. So this is our Euler-Lagrange equation. Okay, and this is how we got the differential equation, by optimizing the functional. Okay, and however, what happens to these two terms? Because the net sum is supposed to be 0, but then how can I write this to be such and such? Okay, the thing is, I can assume delta u to be any arbitrary quantity, even a quantity which is basically this quantity between x equals 0 and L, and at the boundary it is such that these terms are equal 0. Since it can be anything, okay, so therefore the only way this is to satisfy that the whatever is inside the integration, that is going to 0, and whatever are the boundary condition, they are when all of them considered together go to 0. Now you need to understand that the bar is being held at x equals 0, so the variation itself is 0 at x equals 0, because the value of u is known, not because value of u is 0, but because the value of u is known at x equals 0. So we cannot have a variation over u at x equals 0. So at x equals 0, this is 0. But what happens at x equal L? What we get to know is at x equal L, ea u prime minus p times delta u at L equals 0. Okay, so the value of u prime at L and delta u at x equal L. Remember, delta u and u are not the same quantity. This is the variation, this is the actual solution, rather the derivative of the actual solution. Now this quantity goes to 0 for any arbitrary delta u. Now delta u can be anything. So the only way that is true is when this is true. ea u prime at L equals P. So we get the Neumann boundary condition. Neumann boundary condition is on the normal derivative of the variable. Normal derivative as in, if you really think about it, this face of the bar, normal to that direction is x direction, and the displacement or the primary variable that you are solving for is u, and its derivative with respect to x is its normal derivative, and the boundary condition on the normal derivative is the Neumann boundary condition. So the Dirichlet boundary condition is given to us, and Neumann boundary condition that we get out of our variational formulation by taking the first variation. Okay, so so let us see that what this basically means. It basically means let's say right at this step t, I take a differential element dx. So here I am applying a force P, and here I have the stress sigma. Okay, of course there is distributed load Q of x here. So I can write P equals sigma times A, rather P plus Q of x times dx equals sigma times A. You see, these are all finite quantities, and this is a differential quantity. And actually, you can make dx as much small as you want. Okay, so much small that these two faces are not different faces but the same face. Okay, so basically the idea that we get is the stress value at x equal L is simply P by A. Now what about the strain value, or rather what is the stress? It is E times epsilon at L. Now how much is epsilon? Epsilon is U prime at L is actually P divided by A. So when you multiply with A, you get P. So the idea is the one that we are getting as a boundary condition, we could have also gotten from the free body diagram. And because we are drawing a free body diagram, whose approach is this one? এই পার্টটা কি বোঝা গেল না?
হ্যাঁ স্যার বোঝা গেছে।
কি বোঝা গেছে? কি জিজ্ঞেস করলাম কি?
স্যার whose approach?
Whose approach? Yeah, so that's a question, right? Since we are drawing a free body diagram,
Newton sir.
Newton's approach. Okay, so what I'm trying to show here is Newton's approach. I mean, I can get this boundary condition without doing this variational formulation. That's what I'm trying to say here. We can directly get this boundary condition from the free body diagram. Okay, so what would be Newton's approach? Sorry. So Newton's approach would be to draw free body diagrams. Okay. So imagine if I take this differential element of length x. On this side, there is stress sigma plus d sigma dx. On this side there is sigma, and then I am applying this differential or this distributed load right here. So I have the following equation of equilibrium. Sigma fx must be 0 for equilibrium, and therefore sigma plus sigma prime dx times a minus sigma times a, then plus q times x, and the length of this differential element is dx, so q times dx should be equal to 0. Or in other words, I get sigma prime times a minus sigma primes times a plus q of x equals 0. Now if I write sigma prime, now this is a function of x, so that if I write as e times epsilon prime, because because we are assuming the material to be your homogeneous material, so Young's modulus is not changing across the length. So then this can be written as e times epsilon prime times a. Now epsilon prime, because epsilon is u prime, it can be written as u double prime. So in the end, I have ea u double prime plus q of x equals 0 as a differential equation. Okay, and I have, it's a second order differential equation, so I have two boundary conditions. Number one, which is evident, the essential boundary condition in gamma u, which is at x1 u is 0, and number two is called the traction boundary or gamma t, where basically you have been given ea u prime equals p. So this is where the Dirichlet boundary condition is given. This is where the Neumann boundary condition is given. And one more thing about gamma t and gamma u, the total boundary, whether it's the geometry is a straight line or the geometry is is an area. When it is an area, the boundary is this entire line. When it's a volume, this boundary is this entire surface. And there's certain way to describe these surfaces and lines. For example, this line is an open line. An open line would have boundary, and those boundaries are points. This area is an open area. An open area has a boundary, okay, and the boundary is a closed line. The boundary of an open area is a closed curve, okay. Now if it is a volume, then it is bounded by a closed surface which doesn't have a boundary, okay. So imagine a football, okay, it's or any other volume, its surface is a closed surface, and that surface doesn't have any boundary, okay. Now whether you are solving problem in 1D, 2D or 3D, your boundary would change, the shape of the boundary would change, but what would remain common is that your total boundary is simply the union of your boundary where the uh, displacement boundary condition is given and where the traction boundary condition is given, okay. For example, here I could have simply skipped putting a p right here. There is no p, okay, but then still it would be gamma t. Is just that there is a p, but that p is 0, okay. Such is not the case with essential boundary condition. uh, the natural boundary condition, the so-called natural boundary condition, okay, applies automatically. If you do not specify, it becomes 0. So there has to be gamma u and gamma t, and the union of the two sets is basically the total boundary. And also the intersection of the two sets is a null set, okay. You cannot apply gamma displacement boundary condition and the traction boundary condition at the same location. um, Okay, what else? Okay, so what we did was we got the variational form for the bar problem. Okay, and we also got the differential equation out of it. Okay, so whenever mm, so we saw the problem statement given in three different forms. Okay, um, we saw the problem statement given in three different forms. So one is the minimization statement, minimization or aim statement. Number two is variational or V statement. And number three is a so-called differential equation or strong form. And these three, the aim statement, the V statement, and the strong form, okay, all are equivalent to one another. Okay, so what is so strong about strong form, and what is so not so strong about these two forms, or the so-called weak forms? You see, if you look into weak forms, consider the bar problem. For example, in aim statement you had encountered this term u prime squared. So if you are looking for an approximate solution, listen to this carefully. Although the three methods are equivalent, but if you are looking for an approximate solution, you can have a function as an admissible function which is singly differentiable. Let's say if the function is something like c0 plus c1x, that is an admissible function for approximate solution when using the aim statement. If you look carefully in your v statement also, the variational form or the first variation expression, there also you have terms like ea u prime and delta u prime. So there also you need your function, okay, to be singly differentiable. But if you look at the strong form, this is essentially this is essentially essentially has this expression. So in order for a function to be admissible in this expression, it should be at least doubly differentiable, even if you are looking for an approximate solution. And that's what is strong about strong form. Other than that, the three forms are basically equivalent of one another. So if you have one form, we can go to the other. Okay, the only thing makes them equivalent of one another is the arbitrariness of the variation. Okay, if the variation is arbitrary, then only you can go with this this equivalence. Okay, but if your variation is always supposed to be from the set of functions that you are looking for. If you are instead looking for not so currently you are looking for all possible functions. You see, if qx is 0, then u is a linear function. If qx is a uh, qx is a constant, u is a quadratic function. Okay, if qx is a linear function, then u is a cubic function. Okay, and so on and so forth. So there is a dependence on q, and if q is sinusoidal or exponential or hyperbolic functions, then the nature of u would also change. So the thing is there is a so u can be any function. In a general problem where the form of q is not known, q could also be a step function, right? So you have this bar. I'm not applying distributed load everywhere, but only at the second half of the bar. Okay, so it could also be a step function. So q as a function of x could also be this. Okay, so for an arbitrary function, the solution is also in arbitrary, right? So that means if you're looking for solution of delta y or delta u in the all possible set of functions, okay, or if rather you are considering the variation to be general, then this is fine. One second. So if you're looking for set of all functions for a possible solution, then these three statements are exactly equivalent of one another. But if you're looking for only a set of functions which are of the nature c0 plus c1x, and therefore if you are looking for y in a set of functions which look like this, your variation would also be in this from the same set, and because of that the only arbitrariness here is with c0 and c1, okay, but that still is going to give you a linear function. So if you are only looking into linear functions, okay, that's when the approximation happens, okay. So it's not like the strong form gives you only exact solution and the weak forms only give you approximate solution. The approximation lies in the search space or the set from which you allow the function to be, okay. So if that set is of course the set of all linear functions, okay, is a subset of this set right here. So so if you're looking in a subset, that's when the uh, error comes, okay. And of course there are methods to improve the error, so all of those we would discuss in the next class. But for the time being, I would appreciate if you go through whatever has been discussed today regarding the getting of the strong form of the bar deflection using two different methods, one from the potential energy, the other one from the strong form. Sorry, other one from the your free body diagrams. Okay. Um, so because all of these forms are equivalent of one another and there is a proof for that, but for the time being I'm just skipping that proof. What we can do is what we can show that if I'm given the differential equation, and this part is going to be more important for us, going from strong form to variational statement. That's what we would do repeatedly. So let's say I have been given this differential equation right here, and the following boundary conditions. Okay. So what we can do is we can say V is the variation of U, and B0 equals 0, since u0 is given. And what we can do next is we can multiply the whole thing and integrate between 0 to L, along with okay. Now you see this quantity is 0. You can multiply this with anything, that should be 0. This quantity is 0 between 0 and L, so you can multiply with any function of x, okay, and integrate over 0 to L, and this should be 0. Now that's where you need to put the arbitrariness of variation for all v. This should be true for all v of x. And when you do that, these two statements become equivalent. So basically, from top you can go to the bottom line, or from the bottom you can go to the top line. Only when it is true for all variations that you can write the above strong form. And when you are writing the weak form from the strong form, do mention the arbitrariness of the variation. Now here, for the first term, we would do an integration by parts. So what do we have? So what we want to do here is get rid of the differentiation from u and put it on v. So we are integrating this ea u prime v 0 to L minus 0 to L ea u prime v prime plus q of x dx plus p times v of L minus ea u prime L v of L equals 0. Now, of course, v at x equals 0 is 0. So the only term that survives here is the one at x equal L, which is basically the same term as this one. Okay. Then we will remain with the following variational form. So by the way, this one is minus. So yeah, dx equals integration 0 to L q of x dx plus p vl, and this expression right here is our desired variational form. So a typical aim statement would be minimize with respect to u pi, which is half a u, where a is a linear operator. An operator here means some form of integration or any other expression. It's a so a is a bilinear operator minus L of u. It's a linear operator. It's not only bilinear, it is also symmetric. Okay. And the typical V statement would look something like this. V statement would be a uv equals L of V for all V. So this one is important. The arbitrariness of V is important. Okay. Now, what do I mean by symmetric bilinear? First of all, symmetry means AUV equals AVU. Also, bilinear means AU alpha 1 V1 plus alpha 2 V2 is basically A alpha 1 times A UV1 plus alpha 2 times A UV2. Okay. Now, these, if you want to look carefully, you can find here this one right here is your AUV. Okay. You see, it doesn't actually have U and V, it has U prime V prime, but together it is a linear operation in U and V. So it's first taking derivative with respect to x and then integrating, doing a definite integral from 0 to L. Okay. And sorry, this one will also have this is not just Q of x, this also would have V, Qx Vx dx. So these terms are again linear in V. What do I mean by linear? If I were to write L alpha u plus beta V, that would be alpha Lu plus beta Lv. Okay, so which is quite evident because all we have is a summation and an integration. Okay, so all of these are basically an addition and an integration. So all of these are linear operation, and therefore these are your are this is this the right hand side forms a linear form. Okay, and if you compare the earlier potential energy statement that we wrote, okay, uh, if this is our L of V, our L of U would simply be work potential. And if this is our AUV, then half of AUU is our strain energy. Okay. So if you compare the earlier expression that we wrote of potential energy, then you can directly correlate between how the minimization statement and the variation statement work, and that the one can be obtained from the other, that we would look in Monday's class.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay, sir.